The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 10. Aesthetic and Ethical Culture. The idea of culture begins to define itself for us a little more clearly, or at least it has put away from it, in a clear contrast, its natural opposites. The unmental, the purely physical life, is very obviously its opposite. It is barbarism, the unintellectualized vital, the crude economic, or the grossly domestic life, which looks only to money-getting. The procreation of a family and its maintenance are equally its opposites. They are another and even uglier barbarism. We agree to regard the individual who is dominated by them and has no thought of higher things as an uncultured and undeveloped human being, a prolongation of the savage, essentially a barbarian, even if he lives in a civilized nation and in a society which has arrived at the general idea and at some ordered practice of culture and refinement. The societies or nations which bear this stamp we agree to call barbarous or semi-barbarous. Even when a nation or an age has developed within itself knowledge and science and arts, but still in its general outlook, its habits of life and thought, is content to be governed not by knowledge and truth and beauty and high ideals of living, but by the gross vital, commercial, economic view of existence. We say that that nation or age may be civilized in a sense, but for all its abundant or even redundant appliances and apparatus of civilization, it is not the realization or the promise of a cultured humanity. Therefore, upon even the European civilization of the 19th century, with all its triumphant and teeming production, its great developments of science, its achievement in the works of the intellect, we pass a certain condemnation, because it has turned all these things to commercialism and to gross uses of vitalistic success. We say of it that this was not the perfection to which humanity ought to aspire, and that this trend travels away from and not towards the higher curve of human evolution. It must be our definite verdict upon it that it was inferior as an age of culture to ancient Athens, to Italy of the Renaissance, to ancient or classical India. For great as might be the deficiencies of social organization in those eras, and though their range of scientific knowledge and material achievement was immensely inferior, yet they were more advanced in the art of life, knew better its object, and aimed more powerfully at some clear ideal of human perfection. In the range of the mind's life itself, to live in its merely practical and dynamic activity, or in the mentalized, emotional, or sensational current, a life of conventional conduct, average feelings, customary ideas, opinions, and prejudices, which are not one's own, but those of the environment, to have no free and open play of mind, but to live grossly and unthinkingly by the unintelligent rule of the many, to live besides according to the senses and sensations controlled by certain conventions, but neither purified nor enlightened nor chastened by any law of beauty. All this, too, is contrary to the ideal of culture. A man may so live with all the appearance or all the pretensions of a civilized existence, enjoy successfully all the plethora of its appurtenances, but he is not in the real sense a developed human being. A society following such a rule of life may be anything else you will, vigorous, decent, well-ordered, successful, religious, moral, but it is a Philistine society. It is a prison which the human soul has to break. For so long as it dwells there, it dwells in an inferior, uninspired, and unexpanding mental status. It vegetates infructuously in the lower stratum, and is governed not by the higher faculties of man, but by the crudities of the unuplifted sense-mind. Nor is it enough for it to open windows in this prison, by which it may get draughts of agreeable fresh air, something of the free light of the intellect, something of the fragrance of art and beauty, something of the large breadth of wider interests and higher ideals. It has yet to break out of its prison altogether, and live in that free light, in that fragrance and large breadth. Only then does it breathe the natural atmosphere of the developed mental being. Not to live principally in the activities of the sense mind, but in the activities of knowledge and reason, and a wide intellectual curiosity, the activities of the cultivated aesthetic being, the activities of the enlightened will, which make for character and high ethical ideals and a large human action, not to be governed by our lower or our average mentality, but by truth and beauty, and the self-ruling will is the ideal of a true culture, and the beginning of an accomplished humanity. We get then, by elimination, to a positive idea and definition of culture. But still on this higher plane of the mental life, we are apt to be pursued by old exclusivenesses and misunderstandings. We see that in the past there seems often to have been a quarrel between culture and conduct. Yet, according to our definition, conduct also is a part of the cultured life, and the ethical ideality, one of the master impulses of the cultured being. The opposition which puts on one side the pursuit of ideas and knowledge and beauty, and calls that culture, and on the other the pursuit of character and conduct, and exalts that as the moral life, must start evidently from an imperfect view of human possibility and perfection. Yet that opposition has not only existed, but is a naturally strong tendency of the human mind, and therefore must answer to some real and important divergence in the very composite elements of our being. It is the opposition which Arnold drew between Hebraism and Hellenism, the trend of the Jewish nation, which gave us the severe ethical religion of the Old Testament, crude, conventional, and barbarous enough in the Mosaic Law, but rising to undeniable heights of moral exaltation when to the law were added the prophets, and finally exceeding itself and blossoming into a fine flower of spirituality in Judaic Christianity. Footnote 1. The epithet is needed, for European Christianity has been something different, even at its best, of another temperament, Latinized, Grecized, Celticized, or else only a rough Teutonic imitation of the Old World Hebraism. Was dominated by the preoccupation of a terrestrial and ethical righteousness, and the promised rewards of right worship and right doing, but innocent of science and philosophy, careless of knowledge, indifferent to beauty. The Hellenic mind was less exclusively, but still largely dominated by a love of the play of reason for its own sake, but even more powerfully by a high sense of beauty, a clear aesthetic sensibility, and a worship of the beautiful in every activity, in every creation, in thought, in art, in life, in religion. So strong was this sense that not only manners but ethics were seen by it to a very remarkable extent in the light of its master idea of beauty. The good was to its instinct largely the becoming and the beautiful. In philosophy itself, it succeeded in arriving at the conception of the divine as beauty, a truth which the metaphysician very readily misses, and impoverishes his thought by missing it. But still, striking as is this great historical contrast, and powerful as were its results on European culture, we have to go beyond its outward manifestation if we would understand in its source this psychological opposition. The conflict arises from that sort of triangular disposition of the higher or more subtle mentality, which we have already had occasion to indicate. There is in our mentality a side of will, conduct, character, which creates the ethical man. There is another side of sensibility to the beautiful, understanding beauty in no narrow or hyper-artistic sense, which creates the artistic and aesthetic man. Therefore, there can be such a thing as a predominantly or even exclusively ethical culture. There can be, too, evidently, a predominantly or even exclusively aesthetic culture. There are at once created two conflicting ideals, which must naturally stand opposed and look askance at each other with a mutual distrust, or even reprobation. The aesthetic man tends to be impatient of the ethical rule. He feels it to be a barrier to his aesthetic freedom and an opposition on the play of his artistic sense and his artistic faculty. He is naturally hedonistic, for beauty and delight are inseparable powers, and the ethical rule tramples on pleasure, even very often on quite innocent pleasures, and tries to put a straight waistcoat on the human impulse to delight. He may accept the ethical rule when it makes itself beautiful, or even seize on it as one of his instruments for creating beauty, but only when he can subordinate it to the aesthetic principle of his nature, just as he is often drawn to religion by its side of beauty, pomp, magnificent ritual, emotional satisfaction, repose, or poetic ideality and aspiration. We might almost say by the hedonistic aspects of religion. Even when fully accepted, it is not for their own sake that he accepts them. The ethical man repays this natural repulsion with interest. He tends to distrust art and the aesthetic sense as something lax and emollient, something in its nature undisciplined, and by its attractive appeals to the passions and emotions, destructive of a high and strict self-control. He sees that it is hedonistic, and he finds that the hedonistic impulse is non-moral and often immoral. It is difficult for him to see how the indulgence of the aesthetic impulse, beyond a very narrow and carefully guarded limit, can be combined with a strict ethical life. He evolves the Puritan, who objects to pleasure on principle, not only in his extremes, and a predominant impulse tends to become absorbing and leads towards extremes, but in the core of his temperament he remains fundamentally the Puritan. The misunderstanding between these two sides of our nature is an inevitable circumstance of our human growth, which must try them to their fullest separate possibilities and experiment in extremes in order that it may understand the whole range of its capacities.